Amna Al-Thani, Georgetown University in Doha. Thank you for inviting me to be your speaker. Whether it's distinguished or not, you can judge for yourself later. I was glad to hear the bit about the mobile phone because in Dublin in Ireland a few months ago I said that if anyone's phone rang while I was speaking, they would be sold into slavery. And immediately a phone rang, and it was mine. So you can keep your phones on, it doesn't matter at all. On 9/11, which I still usually insist on calling the 11th of September 2001, I was flying across the Atlantic. I had actually just filed a long report to my newspaper on what really happened during the Sabra and Shatila massacres between the 16th and 18th of September 1982. I was in the camps before the massacre ended, and I had to climb over heaps of corpses in the camp, and I had just discovered that more than half the 1,700 Palestinian dead had in fact been shot into mass graves, in some cases days after the massacre officially ended. And my mobile phone, as I was getting on my flight from Paris, started purring away, and it was the features editor told me, "Robert, there's a light aircraft flown into the World Trade Center in New York. We're holding your peace." And damn, it's the last thing I wanted. Here, oddly enough and ironically, was the kind of reason that drives the fury in the Middle East that may have produced what we were about to see take place in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. Anyway, I got on the aircraft, my phone went again, and the foreign desk was on the phone saying 2 aircraft, and they're both airliners. So I knew this was an attack, not an accident. And as the plane took off, I mentioned to the senior person, the senior stewardess, that the pilot should know what's going on at our destination. And in fact, after about 10 minutes, he came back and we spoke, and he wanted to know any more aircraft. So I rang London and found 2 more. And then the senior stewardess looked at me and said, "Where did the planes come from?" And of course, we didn't know at that stage whether the aircraft were domestic flights, as they were within the United States with a full payload of fuel, or whether they might have come from Africa or from Europe. At which point the senior purser and I looked at each other very seriously, because I know a lot of the crews, because I fly Air France across the Atlantic a lot, and he and I went round our aircraft looking for passengers we didn't like. I found 13, 4 in business class. He found 14, 3 in business class. And of course, they were all Muslims, weren't they? Because they had beards, or were reading the Quran, or they had worry beads, or they had brown eyes, or they were looking very suspiciously at Mr. Robert, because Mr. Robert was looking very suspiciously at them. And when I got back to the front of the aircraft, I realized that Osama bin Laden, whom I was sure was involved, had turned nice, liberal, lefty Robert Fisk into a racist in about 2.5 minutes. Much more interesting, however, was after the plane turned round, because of course, excuse me, I like getting rid of rubbish. After the plane turned round, because of course, when we were over the Atlantic, America closed its airspace. I got back to France and my phone started purring away again like a budgerigar. All the usual suspects, CNN, CBS, ABC, mercifully Fox wasn't on the line, even Irish radio. They were, of course, they knew I'd met bin Laden, they wanted to ask what I thought, etc., etc. What was interesting is that they wanted to ask who did it. 19 Arabs who called themselves Muslims. And how it was done, simple, box cutters, tall buildings, airliners, airplanes. But they wouldn't ask why. And every time I raised the question, well, hold on, let's ask why, they moved on. Well, do you think bin Laden was involved? I mean, do you think this was thought up in advance? Were there dummy runs? I kept saying, but why? And in the evening, it ended up in a radio interview via Dublin, again in Ireland, with an outrageous, raving academic from Harvard, who shall remain nameless, it was Dershowitz, of course, who suddenly took enormous exception to me because I asked the question why. He said, to ask the question why Mr. Fisk, you are a dangerous man. That is being pro-terrorist, anti-American, and he said that is the same as being anti-Semitic. So I got the point. To ask why about 9/11, you were a Nazi. So shut up, Fisk. Of course, I didn't. We actually pulled the plug on Dershowitz. I loved that moment. But what I did say before he was closed down was, look, when you have an ordinary crime on the streets, not of Qatar, I'm sure, but when you have on Doha, when you have an ordinary crime on the street, the first thing the police do is look for a motive. But when we had an international crime against humanity in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania, the one thing journalists were not supposed to do was look for a motive. I wonder why not. Because you then have to say, well, these men were Arabs. That means they came from the Middle East. Is there a problem out there? And then, of course, you'd have to go on to look at the relationship between America and the Arab world and America and Israel, and that would bring up the question of why America can't seem to make a peace process work. Oh, God, the language of journalism, you know? The peace process was always being put back on track. Do you remember that, the language, the cliches? Now we have a roadmap, so it can't be put back on a track, but we'll see what happens. But what was happening, in fact, was something I'd been very worried about for a long time. The failure, seriously, to address the issues of the Middle East, fairly and with justice, because justice is what it's all about. Not democracy, not human rights, though I'm sure the Arabs would like some packages of human rights off our supermarket shelves. The issue is about justice, pure and simple. Anyway, what I found I was in the end confronting by reading other newspapers, one or two of whom condemned me for asking the question why, which they should have been asking. What we were confronting, especially in the United States, was the parasitic, osmotic relationship between journalists and power, between journalists and the US administration. And what was happening was that through a mixture of fear and laziness, and by the way, I'm not the only journalist who's trying to get through this particular net. I have many colleagues who are trying to do what I'm trying to do. But there are a large number of people, particularly in television, who, in order to stay uncontroversial, will not use the real words for the brutality and bloodshed they're watching. Typical examples. Over and over again, since Colin Powell, when he was Secretary of State, told US diplomats in the Middle East, you are not to refer to the occupied territories as occupied, you are to refer to them as disputed. American correspondents and some European have basically gone along with this. They are disputed territories. Similarly, the wall, and I was in Israel a few weeks ago, and the wall is bigger than the Berlin Wall and longer than the Berlin Wall, is called a fence or a security barrier. Sicherheits was the word the East German government used about the Berlin Wall. And so we come to the word Jewish neighborhood instead of Jewish settlement, or what it really is, a colony built illegally for Israelis and Israelis only against all international law on Arab land. And by failing to use the real words, we desemanticize the conflict. If, after all, you see a child hurling a stone, and I'm against all violence for any reason ever, and you know it's because his land is occupied, or there's a wall running through his town, or because people are taking his father's and family's land away, you can understand why he chucks a stone. But if it's only about a dispute, something you can solve over a cup of tea or in a law court, if it's about a fence which we may have at the bottom of the garden or alongside a road, if it's about a neighborhood, like the east side of Doha, then anyone who throws a stone must be generically violent. And thus, through our journalistic cowardice, we make it easier for those who suffer to become the aggressors and those who are the occupiers to become the victims. I always remember when Madeleine Albright announced that Israel was under siege. For a brief moment, I asked myself if there were Palestinian tanks in Haifa. How do we reach a stage where we so distort reality that we actually have a lethal effect on the conflict itself? The worst example of this, I'm sorry to say, is television. The way in which unless an Iraqi is obliging enough in a war to die romantically beside the road in silhouette with all his arms still attached, you do not see the dead. For viewers of television, not in the Arab world, I might add, but in the West, we do not see the dead. And thus our leaders, all of whom at the moment have zero experience of real war, the journalists do, but not our leaders in the West, they are able to present to the public war as a bloodless sandpit. War as something primarily to do with victory and defeat, rather than death, which is exactly what it is about on a large scale. War represents the total failure of the human spirit. And I had a perfect example of this in 2003. I was in Baghdad, and I was trying to get down to Basra. I got halfway, and then I was so frightened I could hardly write, and there were so many bombs dropping from my own dear Air Force, among others, that I turned back to Baghdad. But Al Jazeera were in Basra, and they got back the same day to Baghdad with their video film. And I sat with them in their little tent. You probably realize that in a war, many of the big agencies pool their material, especially the television companies. So it was being sent through the satellite to Reuters in London, whose job was to edit the film. So, of course, this was film of a civilian hospital. There were some soldiers brought in wounded and dead, but most of the pictures were of dead and wounded women and children. They had been killed and wounded by British artillery fire in Basra. The British were besieging Basra while the Americans took the highway to claim Baghdad. And what was particularly revealing was, as they showed the film, listen to the remarks coming back from London. You know, there were terrible scenes. There was one of a child holding its intestines in, a woman with part of her hand missing. And there were screams and cries and lots of blood on the film. And the voice from London said, you know, we can't really show this. You can't show this to people at tea time. And by this moment, I had my notebook out. For The Independent, my newspaper, this was going to be tonight's story. So they said, please, please, we risked our life for this. Just let us put out a little bit more of the film. Maybe you can use it. And of course, there were more pictures of blood and wounded children and dead children. And then the voice came back and said, this is obscene. We can't put obscene pictures like this on Western television. They pleaded again. By now, of course, my pen was skidding over the pages. These were great quotes because this is what was wrong. And then the voice came back for the third and final time. We can't show these pictures because we must respect the dead. Now, you get the point. We didn't respect them when they were alive. We didn't respect them when we blew them to bits. But when they're dead, by God, we have to respect them. Thus, the Tony Blairs of this world don't have to look at the deaths which they cause. By the way, if anyone has an idea for a question at the end, explain Tony Blair, don't ask it. I haven't the slightest idea. I mean, the amazing thing is he has such a close relationship with God, you'd think that from time to time God gave him some advice. Like, you know, Tony, this Iraq thing may not be such a good idea. I talked to a very good friend of mine, a very fine journalist, Mira Haas of the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Mira works from the West Bank, writes from Ramallah, and does so with more courage than most of my Western colleagues do. And I was asking her one day in Jerusalem, this is 3 or 4 years ago now, perhaps even 5 years ago, I said, Mira, tell me, what is the purpose of a foreign correspondent? And she said, well, what do you think it is, Robert? So, of course, being a Brit, I began to say, oh, well, you know, we are the neutral first witnesses to history, blah, 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 blah. We English have a habit of going blah, blah, blah. And she sadly shook her head and said, no, Robert, our job is to monitor the centers of power, especially when they go to war and especially when they use lies to do it. And I think that's the best definition of our job, or what our job should be, that I've ever heard. And I have noted, given the copyright to Amira. Amira receives much hate mail and much hate email. I don't use the internet or email, so don't try to email me, ask a question or write a letter. But Amira fights hard to get the truth out, much harder than her Western colleagues. Why don't we tell the truth? I think one of the reasons, of course, is that we are frightened of being called anti-Semitic, like Al Dershowitz tried out before we pulled the plug. And I think to call a decent person anti-Semitic because he dares to criticize Israel is shameful, because it will make anti-Semitism respectable, and shame upon those people who make these false accusations against us as journalists. We're always being told, oh, you're biased, you're on the side of terrorism, Al Dershowitz, you're on the side of Palestinians, you're on the side of Arabs. No. You know, when I started off in journalism on a small, horrible, no, it was kind to me, newspaper in the northeast of England, the Newcastle Evening Chronicle, we were given journalism school lessons in which your basic job was to tell half of one person's story in one side of the story and the alternative side of the story in the next half. In other words, 50-50 journalism. That's okay if you're reporting a football match. It's okay if you're reporting a public inquiry on a new motorway. You know, you put in the local authorities' reason for building the motorway and the reasons why the protesters object to the path the motorway will take. But the Middle East is not a football match. It is a bloody tragedy. And our job as journalists, I believe, should be to be neutral and unbiased on the side of those who suffer. If we were reporting the slave trade in the 18th century, would we be expected to give equal time to the slave ship captain? No, we'd talk to the slaves and find out how many of them had died on the ship. If we were present at the liberation of a Nazi extermination camp, would we give half our story to the SS spokesman? No. We would talk to the survivors and learn about the Jewish dead. When I was in Jerusalem in August of 2001, with the clock going tick, tick, tick towards September, an Islamic Jihad suicide bomber blew him up in the Sabaru Pizzeria restaurant near St. George's Street. This is in Israeli Jewish West Jerusalem. And when I got there, because I was down the road, I saw an Israeli woman with a chair leg through her and a kid with no eyes. Did I give equal time to Islamic Jihad? No, I did not. And when I was in the Sabra Shatila camps of Beirut in 1982, climbing over those corpses, I wrote about the survivors and the victims. I did not give equal time to the Israeli excuses for sending the Lebanese Christian Phalangist murderers into the camp. I think there are moral issues involved in journalism when you're reporting the whole Middle East region. So what do we do? I find in America, constantly, it is the official government point of view that is in the major newspapers. I don't buy the New York Times, I only read it when I can sneak it off for free. But I was in LA, Los Angeles, when the American edition of my last book, Great War for Civilization, came out. And my morning Los Angeles Times, I was going to talk about the problems of American journalism. And I don't, as I say, use email, so you can see I actually photocopied the newspaper. Page 1 had a story saying, in a battle of wits, Iraq's insurgency mastermind, we journalists love masterminds, you know, another cliche, like tanks always roll over porous borders. In a battle of wits, Iraq's insurgency mastermind stays a step ahead of the United States. The man they're talking about is Abu Musab Zarqawi, of course, who was later killed by the Americans. The writers of the story are Josh Meyer and Mark Mazzetti, writing from Washington. Jolly good place to report Iraq from. The first paragraph says, despite the recent arrest of one of his would-be suicide bombers in Jordan and some top aides in Iraq, insurgency mastermind Abu Musab Zarqawi has eluded capture, US authorities say, because this network his network has a much better intelligence gathering operation than they do. But look at the sourcing in this story. Still page 1. US officials said one US Justice Department counterterrorism official. Officials said, US authorities say, US officials said, we're going on to page A10 of the Los Angeles Times. Several US officials said, those officials said, US officials confirmed, American officials complained, US officials stressed, US authorities believe, said one senior, I'm going on, said one senior US intelligence official, US officials said, Jordanian officials said, there's a change of geography there. Several US officials said, American officials said, US officials say US officials, but US officials said, one US counterterrorism official said. If that is journalism, ladies and gentlemen, I'm out of work. Why not just call the LA Times American officials said? if you think this is odd, here we are 2 years later in the New York Times. Mark Mazzetti again, he's gone up in the world, he's been promoted, he's on the New York Times now. According to American intelligence and counterterrorism officials, British and American investigators said, intelligence officials said, I'm not going to waste my time with any more. This is what I mean by the osmotic parasitic relationship between American journalism and power. The need to get close, to have contact, to be in on the story. And knowing, of course, that if you write something power doesn't like, you'll be outside the story. And thus, of course, the whole purpose of producing a newspaper goes up the chimney. I was saying earlier on today at a talk with students and faculty at Georgetown that the American newspaper editors are blaming the internet for their lowering circulations. I don't believe it. I think people are going to the internet because they know they're being lied to in the American press. I was at a meeting in Brooklyn, a conference in which I had a BBC executive, a woman executive beside me, who irritatingly kept calling herself an exec, who said that the great thing about the BBC was that when you could look at the internet, you could go and check it on the BBC afterwards. I said, no, they've gone to the internet because you failed them. I think in Britain and France and Italy, where we have newspapers that do try to tell the truth, I think the problem is the actual internet. Too many people are going there because it's free. I had a guy in Detroit, I think it was Detroit or Denver, not long ago, who started saying, we have the right to freedom of information, Mr. Fisk, you do not have the right to make us pay. Well, fine, but who's going to pay my airfare to Cairo next week, you know? There's a major problem out there. But let's go back to journalism and see how it's used. During the Gaza war, there have been so many, but you know which one I'm talking about, 2008, 2009, I followed my usual principle that if I can't be in the war, I won't report on it. I'm not going to sit on that bloody hill outside Gaza with all those TV journalists in flak jackets and big blue spacesuits pontificating about the smoke in the distance. What I did notice, though, and I was in Canada, what I did notice was a curious propaganda system working its way through the press, not only in Canada, but in Europe and in Ireland. Let me give an example of what I mean. Those journalists who wanted to put Israel's point of view tried to make the people in the various countries feel they were as Israelis at Sderot, the town which received rockets from Hamas. There was once an Arab name for Sderot, but none of us know it now, do we? And here's Lorne Gunter, for example, in the National Post, whose founder, Conrad Black, is now in a Florida penitentiary. It doesn't say that in the newspaper, but that's where he is. Listen to how he goes on, how he begins. He's talking about Toronto. Suppose you lived in the Toronto suburb of Don Mills, and people from the suburb of Scarborough, there are a lot of Muslim Canadians live in Scarborough, were firing as many 100 rockets a day into your yard, your kids' school, the strip mall down the street, and your dentist's office. See how the argument is going. I went over to Montreal, and I opened my newspaper. And what do I find in La Presse? I'll translate this for you. Imagine for a moment that the children of Longueuil, a suburb of Montreal, live day and night in shock that their homes, shops, hospitals, schools are the target of terrorists located in Brossard. Brossard is a suburb which has quite a lot of Afghan Canadians, but never mind. I get across the Atlantic. Thank God, we're out. I open my newspaper. Is France prepared to hold its fire if Belgium starts lobbing explosives across its border? Anyway, at last I get to Ireland. Whew, breathe in. It's okay. It's not. I open my Irish Times, my favorite newspaper, and find a letter from Zion Evroni, the Israeli ambassador to Ireland. The questions I've been asking the Irish people are fundamental to any discussion of Israel's action. What would you do if Dublin were subjected to a bombardment of 8,000 rockets, no longer 100, notice 8,000, and mortars, similar to that endured by Israeli towns and cities for 8 years? Somebody somewhere is pressing a button on a laptop and sending this stuff out, arguments to put in your local papers, and they won't. Nobody, no editor said, hang on a minute, this is a load of garbage. The people who are dying in the majority are Arabs, not Israelis, which of course was the truth. I was clipping and clipping the most outrageous things. Here's another Canadian newspaper. A letter to the editor. The bleating and crying from Gaza reminds one of petulant children who, after repeatedly poking a large dog with a stick, are upset to learn that it bites. I wouldn't call Israel a dog, but anyway, that's what he was saying. And then here we are again. We're back to the National Post. This is an editorial written for all the readers. Israel's opponents have mastered such techniques as digging up graves and stealing bodies from mortuaries to inflate the carnage on the ground, and much of the Western media has reported casualty figures uncritically. I have never, ever in 34 years in the Middle East, ever come across a case where anyone has dug up dead bodies and scattered them around the scenes of slaughter. It never happened. But there it goes. There it is. And this stuff goes on and again and again. But one thing Gaza did do, which we perhaps fail to realize today, it allowed the Palestinians, because the Israelis have been stupid enough to keep Western journalists out, so we could come along and do our 50-50 stories on the other hand. It allowed the Palestinians to tell their own story of suffering. Nowhere was this more evident than in my own newspaper, The Independent. We had what's called, I'm sure many of you know, a stringer in Gaza. That's to say a Palestinian who wrote for us and was paid by his articles, but he wasn't on the staff. Faraz Akram had not been our stringer for long, and he's a great writer. He writes with a power that many of our Western colleagues fail to utilize, even if they can do it. And on the 4th of January, 2009, his father was killed by one of the early first Israeli airstrikes. He came on in tears to our foreign editor in London, and she said, Faraz, try to write the story. You're on page 1. And so we did that night carry a remarkable piece of literature, as well as a story of mourning. You can see what it looked like. It's my paper's front page, The Death and Life of My Father. I just read you a small section. The phone call came at around 4:20 p.m. on Saturday. A bomb had been dropped on the house at our small farm in northern Gaza. My father was walking from the gate to the farmhouse at the time. It was our beloved place, that farm and its 2-story white house with a red roof. Nestled in a flat, fertile agricultural plain northwest of Beit Lahia, it had lemon groves, orange and apricot trees, and we'd recently bought dairy cows. It was the closest farm to the northern border with Israel. Ironically, we always thought the biggest danger there was not from Israeli troops, who usually went straight past if they were mounting an incursion, but from stray Hamas rockets aimed at the Israeli towns north of us. But shortly before sunset on Saturday, as Israeli ground troops and tanks invaded Gaza in the name of shutting down Hamas rocket sites, the peace of that place was shattered and my father's life extinguished at the age of 48. His father, by the way, was a member of the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas. He was a judge, a good, fluent English speaker. I should also add that Faraz's wife, and this is why he was in such a tortuous situation, was just expecting their first child when his father was killed. He goes on, warplanes and helicopters had swept in, bombing and firing to open up the space for the tanks and ground forces that would follow in the darkness. It was one of those F-16 airstrikes that killed my father. The house was reduced to little more than powder, and of Dad there was nothing much left either. Just a pile of flesh, my uncle, who found him in the rubble, said later with brutal honesty. And Faraz ends his story, my grief carries no desire for revenge, which I know to be always in vain. But in truth, as a grieving son, I am finding it hard to distinguish between what the Israelis call terrorists and the Israeli pilots and tank crews who are invading Gaza. What is the difference between the pilot who blew my father to pieces and the militant who fires a rocket? I have no answers, but just as I am about to become a father, I have lost my father. Now that is as near as you can come to literature. Why don't we read that sort of stuff in the New York Times or the LA Times or most of the Western newspapers? You won't see that on the news agency wires. It's extraordinary to me that, in many cases, soldiers themselves can write much better than us. I should tell you, there's an amazing scene in 1990 after Saddam invaded Kuwait, and hundreds of American reporters arrived, as well as hundreds of Europeans, plus Mr. Robert, of course. And many of the Americans arrived in military costumes. One of them actually had shoes camouflaged with painted maple leaves. As you'll probably be aware, even in Qatar, there aren't an awful lot of maple trees in the desert. The other remarkable thing was that when I went out to actually talk to the Marines, I'm never embedded, so I used to go out in my own little car and chat to them. A lot of the Marines and some members of the 82nd Airborne were writing literary letters about what they were going through and what they thought would happen. I realized after a while that all the soldiers wanted to be journalists and all the journalists wanted to be soldiers. But they couldn't write as well as this US Marine based in Ramadi, you know the town, of course, west of Fallujah, who wrote a series of letters back to his father. I have their permission to read some extracts, just two to you. I don't agree with all this US Marine says, but my God, he knows how to write. Joseph Conrad and Heart of Darkness is in these quotations. Just listen to how this US Marine major, who, by the way, shortly after these letters were written, was badly wounded by the famous improvised explosive device. He actually recovered and stayed in Iraq with his unit. He's talking to his father. We are trying to empower the Iraqi police to walk with us, but the graft has not yet taken. There is something culturally childish in their understanding of basic Western governance and management that will require immeasurable education and probably several generations to overcome if they find it of any interest. That education is, of course, a choice that they have to make on their own. They are not our people. Our understanding of their tribal governance and its relationship to formal civic management is equally naive and charges our frustration. The problem now is that every inconvenience has become our responsibility. And if you think this guy doesn't have a sense of humor, here he is trying to explain to his father democracy in action in Ramadi. So what's new about the new government? What's the news about the new government, you may ask, Dad? Well, the provisional military governor was replaced by the transitional governor, who resigned under threat and was replaced with another transitional governor. He was then replaced by the emergency appointed governor, who has just been replaced by the selected governor chosen by the elected provincial council. He never made a speech or publicized his views, never debated the other candidates, and was not present during the election, never making an acceptance speech. He was promptly kidnapped by a rival tribe, while his tribe fought another tribe on the Syrian border. The recently displaced emergency-appointed governor returned in hopes of regaining the position. However, the deputy governor is now serving as the acting governor, while the actual selected governor is in captivity. But there was an election, so democracy is in full bloom, I am to understand. Yeah, this guy can write. Now listen to this. This is the voice of an occupying soldier. We are now trying to force the power of decision onto the elected provincial council and the city officials. It is a difficult thing to keep myself inactive in matters of governance here. The instinct to impose order and command the requisite discipline in the Iraqi leadership must be quelled in order to allow sovereign stewardship to develop at its native pace and in a native form. I fight myself to remain insignificant in the process. I haven't the nature for passive observation. I share the American fascination with action, and it has consistently betrayed us in our foreign policy. Our continued involvement will continue the state of dependency, and our eventual departure will leave nothing but cosmetic structure here. Iraq will return to what it is. Our common sense is not common to this people, and that understanding must be given proper respect. I do my best, but I twitch with an urge for the folly of intrusion. My God, if you want to know what it's like to be an occupying soldier, that's it. So what do we get in the New York Times? David Brooks. Now, by chance, I don't believe in chance, but anyway, both the articles I'm going to quote from appeared in the New York Times and in US Today on the same day, 3rd of November, 2006. I should add, by the way, that for some reason, nobody reads history books these days, not just because of the internet, but I always say to my colleagues who want to go to the Middle East, read history books, take them with you with your notebook. What happened when the British invaded Iraq in 1917? At a cost, $2,000 to be precise. I actually bought the original poster that General Angus Maud put on the walls of Baghdad in 1917 after the British army occupied Iraq. Part of the reason for the First World War, of course, was to destroy the Ottoman Empire. And it begins, to the people of the Muhafazat, the governorate of Baghdad, we come here not to dominate you, but to liberate you from generations of tyranny. We are not conquerors, and so it goes on and on and on. It was signed General Angus Maud, not General George W. Bush, who, remember, did at least defend the skies of Texas from the Viet Cong. What happened in 1920? I was researching this for my book. There was a British officer killed, so the British army laid siege to a city called Fallujah. And then we laid siege to a city called Najaf and demanded the arrest of a Shiite cleric called Badr. We got Badr, we never got Sadr. I've seen the telegram from British intelligence in Baghdad to the War Office in London in 1920 saying that terrorists were crossing the border from... Yes, you see, you obviously were present in Parliament in 1920. That's exactly what they said. And then Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister in 1920, stood up in the House of Commons and said, if British troops leave Iraq, there will be chaos and civil war. Quite right. You were there in the House of Parliament. It's most extraordinary, the parallels, fingerprint perfect to the present, and we didn't read it. Why not? Why don't we plan anything these days? I think it's because prime ministers and presidents are obsessed by the next news conference, the next TV special. Can we get the capture of Saddam in time for prime time tonight? In 1941, Winston Churchill, who is no hero of mine, set up a cabinet committee to organize the governing of occupied post-war Nazi Germany. This is before June 23rd, the Wehrmacht German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, when we still expected the Germans to invade Britain, not the other way round. 4 years before the end of the war, and there was Churchill planning the occupation of Germany. The next year, Cambridge University started PhD courses for British civil servants in German and local governance in the Land, the local authority in Germany. We didn't have a plan 4 hours before the first tanks crossed the Tigris River. And if we had a plan, it had been chucked out by Cheney and Rumsfeld anyway. We don't plan anymore. We don't look forward in terms of years rather than the next few hours or tomorrow's press conference. Anyway, here's David Brooks in the New York Times. He's just been reading some British history. It's now 2005, 2006. He's 3 years late, but he's got round to it at last. The British tried to encourage responsible Iraqi self-government to no avail, right? And so he goes on, there's a complete social disintegration in Iraq. He says this latest descent was initiated by American blunders, but is exacerbated by the same old Iraqi demons, greed, bloodlust, and a mind-boggling unwillingness to compromise for the common good, even in the face of self-immolation. Iraq is teetering on the edge of futility, whatever that means. It will soon be time to effectively end Iraq. There you go. It will be time to radically diffuse authority down to the only communities that are viable, the clan, the tribe, the sect. See, what was coming out was, and we still hear it now, the Iraqis are not worthy of our high sacrifice. We didn't ask them permission to invade, but now we really pretend we did. Now here's Ralph Peters in USA Today. On the same day, Peters is a former US serviceman. He too has been reading some British history, late again, but there we go. He was convinced the Middle East was so politically, socially, morally, and intellectually stagnant, we had to risk invasion. Shukran jazilan, thank you very much, Ralph. And then he carries on. He's talking about how the Prime Minister, who this was Alawi, and then of course it became his successor, country's Prime Minister has thrown in his lot with al-Sadr. The police are less accountable than they were under Saddam. That's absolutely true. And then he goes on. For all our errors, we did give the Iraqis a unique chance to build a rule of law democracy. They preferred to indulge, here we go again, in old hatreds, confessional violence, ethnic bigotry, and a culture of corruption. It was all their fault. It appears the cynics were right. Arab societies can't support democracy as we know it. Iraq was the Arab world's last chance to board the train to modernity. We're back on a railway train again. to give the region a future, not just a bitter past. But, he says, the streets with gore aren't only a symptom of the Iraqi government's incompetence, but of the comprehensive inability of the Arab world to progress in any sphere of organized human endeavor. Think about that for the while. Well, Georgetown, think about that. You know, it's amazing how this stuff gets printed. Not because it can't be printed, but why does it get printed? Why is it that simple questions aren't asked? You know, my baker in Baghdad, whom I go to buy water off when I visit Baghdad, because anyone who drinks out of a tap will suffer the fate of General Angus Maud, who 3 days after arriving drank milk without boiling it and ended up dead. But seriously, my baker asked me once, he said, Mr. Robert, can you tell me why you, he didn't mean me personally, he meant you, the Western military, why are you in Afghanistan? Why are you in Iraq? Why are you in Tajikistan? The French have an airbase at Dushanbe, flying close air support to the British in Helmand province. Why are you in Turkey? Why are you in Jordan? Why are you in Egypt, which now makes the Abrams M1A1 tank? Why are you in Algeria? There's a US Special Forces post outside Taman Ras in the southern Sahara. Why are you in Yemen? Why are you in Qatar? Why are you in Bahrain, headquarters of the US Gulf Fleet? Why are you in Saudi Arabia? Why, Mr. Robert? And I suddenly realized we hadn't asked that question in our newspapers. Yeah, it's a kind of iron curtain across the Middle East. In fact, it starts in the Arctic, comes down through US bases Britain, US bases Germany, US bases Bosnia, Camp Bondsteel, into Greece, headquarters of the US Sixth Fleet, then of course to Izmir, through Turkey, and all those famous air bases, which we have to deny the Armenian genocide in order to keep. From the tundra and the ice, almost to the equator, we now have a wall of fortresses. What's on the other side? Russia, China, India. Have we any idea what we're doing? By the way, I noticed, I was in Pakistan before, I was in about several other capitals recently, and I found out that the drones that bomb the northwest frontier province of Baluchistan are not coming from Kandahar, as we all thought. They're coming from a Pakistani airbase 50 miles south of Rawalpindi. The drones bombing Pakistan are coming from Pakistan. The Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban, believed that they were being controlled by US soldiers on the top floor of the Marriott Hotel. That's why they bombed the Marriott Hotel in Islamabad. They weren't controlling the drones from there, but that's what they thought. But again, this doesn't come out. Why? Why? The question we don't ask. You know, over and over again, I ask myself why we don't ask these very simple questions. We want to give democracy to the Arab world, the Muslim world. We want to give them packages of human rights from our supermarket shelves. But the people always say to me, what we want is justice. Not using the internet or the Google, I use my own paper files to check things. So I thought I'd look up, not long ago, what was the last time we used the word justice in Iraq? And it turned out to be the name of an American air raid on a western Iraqi village, which was called Operation Infinite Justice, which was not quite the justice I think the Iraqis were talking about. Why do we do this? Why do we no longer look forward into the future and say, hold on a second, what dictators are we creating now? Who's in the palace in Dushanbe? Who's in Kazakhstan? Who's in Uzbekistan? Are these future Saddams we are creating for future wars again? And we don't seem to realize, when I first came to the Middle East 34 years ago, our enemies were all socialist, nationalist, Arabist, pro-Soviet. Oh, you know, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, General Command, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and so on. Here, today, and here I'm briefly going to make Israel an honorary member of the Western world, as opposed to an honorary member of the United States. When we look at these individual points, we forget all our enemies today are Islamist, without exception. There are no nationalists left to fight. It's all Islamic Jihad in Palestine, Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Taliban. And we don't even grasp this fact. We don't even largely reflect upon what I suspect is one of the principal frustrations that exists in this region. that Muslims have kept their faith, and we have not. Whether that's because of the Renaissance, whether it's because of the Treaty of Vienna, whether it's because we went through 2 world wars, largely we have lost our faith in the West. I still see Christians occasionally sneaking into churches on Sundays, but not many. And what has happened is that a people who have kept their faith are now largely dominated socially, economically, politically, and usually militarily by a people who have lost their faith. How do you explain that to yourselves? We don't try to explain it, though we should think about it. Let's go back to looking forward in time. Here is Winston Churchill, again, not one of my heroes, writing Churchill between the wars was out of politics and he needed money. So, of course, he went into journalism. Here's an article he wrote in 1937. Now, remember, this is now 11 years before the Nakba, the Palestinian disaster, 11 years before the foundation of the State of Israel, 2 years before the outbreak of the Second World War, and 30 years before the 67 war that left Golan, Gaza, and the West Bank under Israeli occupation. Churchill writes about the future. The wealthy, crowded, progressive Jewish state will lie in the plains and on the seacoasts of Palestine. Around it and the hills and the uplands stretching far and wide into the illimitable deserts, the warlike Arabs of Syria, of Transjordania, Jordan, of Arabia, backed by the armed forces of Iraq, offer the ceaseless menace of war. To maintain itself, the Jewish state will be armed to the teeth and will bring in every able-bodied man to strengthen its army. But how long will this process be allowed to continue by the great Arab populations in Iraq and Palestine? Can it be expected that the Arabs will stand by impassively and watch the building up with Jewish capital and resources of a Jewish army equipped with the most deadly weapons of war until it was strong enough not to be afraid of them? 1937. And if, Churchill goes on, and if ever the Jewish army reaches that point, who can be sure that cramped within their narrow limits, they will not plunge out into the new, undeveloped lands that lie around them? 67, written in 37. You don't read this kind of thing anymore. You don't read anyone looking into the future. Why are we going on about this Iranian bomb, by the way? Quite apart from the fact that, we're not going to attack North Korea because it's got a bomb. We're not going to attack Pakistan because it's got a bomb. If I was an Iranian, I'd rather like a bomb than I can't be attacked. But quite apart from that, we're not looking forward. Are we going to spend generations, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, deciding, he can have a bomb because he's on our side in the war on terror? He can't have a bomb. There are too many turbans in the government. Justice, justice, justice. And what do we want to do? New weapons, new drones. They're called the Reapers, the ones. The drones now come in flocks of 5, by the way, I discovered when I was up in Peshawar. That's a lot of firepower. So how does one reply to this? I'll finish by reading 2 quotations I've come to love over the years because I used them in my book. In 1919 and 1920, the British were still trying to find out what the Iraqi people thought. Alas, we didn't try to find that out in 2003. Actually, I remember after 2003, a CIA man walked up to me in a Spanish base near Kufa, the same Kufa of Najaf and Kerbala area, and said, "Mr. Fisk, there are armed men on the streets at night. What did we do wrong?" I said, "Now you ask me." I said, "Why don't you take a leaf out of the Roman book?" I'm not recommending crucifixion, but every time the Romans occupied another land, they made all the people there citizens of Rome. Why don't you tell the Iraqis, we love you people, be Americans. You can have American passports, anyone who's got an Iraqi passport. You laugh, but I don't think they would have rushed off to JFK. I don't think they would have poured into Denver or LA. They would have been proud that we genuinely did care for them. But we don't care for them. We don't care at all about them. I always ask Western audiences, can you name a single Iraqi, with the exception of Saddam Hussein, who's been killed since 2003? With the expectation I'll see some hands, can anyone here name a single Iraqi who's been killed since 2003? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. See my point? The last quotations. Here's a British intelligence officer who's interviewing a leading divine, a cleric in Baghdad, Alwan al-Yasri. He's talking to the British official on the 5th of July, 1920. You have offered us independence. We never asked for it. We had never dreamt of it till you put the idea into our heads. For hundreds of years, this country has lived in a state as far removed from independence as it's possible to conceive. Then you come with your promise of independence, and every time we ask for it, you imprison us, which of course is what we did in Cairo. We encouraged the opposition to have a democracy in the Egyptian parliament. They wanted to get rid of the king, so we locked them up, just like we encouraged democracy in Palestine. And we had a genuine democratic election. Those pesky Palestinians voted for the wrong people. I don't believe, by the way, that they wanted an Islamic republic. They got tired of the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. We go on here. Here is the Naqib of Baghdad, Abdul Rahman al-Naqib, talking to Gertrude Bell in 1919. You'll all know who she was. What is all this talk of national self-determination, he asked her. What is its value? He's going to refer now to President Woodrow Wilson, whose 14 points suggested that any nation of people or group of people who spoke the same language and the same ideals should be allowed to have a nation. I trace this to America, and I hear the voice of Wilson. Does Sheikh Wilson know the East and its peoples? Does he know our ways of life and our habits of mind? You English have governed around here for 300 years. Your rule is an example. Pursue your own way. Do not submit to guidance from Sheikh Wilson, or Sheikh Bush for that matter, or Sheikh Blair for that matter. And I have to say, and I'm not saying it because I've been here for a long time, but because I've gone over and over the Middle East like a bus doing a circuitous tour over and over again, year after year, for more than 3 decades. I think the West should always be encouraged to send its teachers and its educators, its builders, its engineers, its bridge builders, its scientists to the Muslim world, to learn as well as to help and teach. But militarily, we have no business being in the Muslim world. It is not our land, and the Muslims of the Middle East and Iran and Afghanistan are not our people. The land belongs to them, not to us. I write that in my paper. There's nothing new about me saying it. But it's strange, in Dublin in Ireland, again, 3rd time tonight, I was talking in the north side of Dublin with a friend of mine, an Irish journalist, Vincent Brown, good friend of mine from the days when I reported Belfast. And I was making this point, and he said, but surely, Robert, the Muslims are a threat to the West. And I said, oh, Vincent, you mean the Syrian army is in Dublin? You mean the Egyptian army is in Washington? You mean the Jordanian army is in London? Excuse me. And there I end my talk to you tonight, just a speaker. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience.
Thank you very much, Robert.
If